Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy. I am delighted to be joined by two guests today to discuss a moral exemplar account of the Atonement, specifically a paper titled Have We No Shame that came out in a recent volume for Faith and Philosophy. My guests are Dr. Allison Krile Thornton, who is a professor at the University of South Alabama, and Dr. Meghan Page, who is a professor of philosophy at Loyola University Maryland. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So I came across every now and then, whenever a new issue of Faith and Philosophy comes out, or the Journal of Analytic Theology, these journals, when a new one comes out, I go through and I see, what papers might be interesting to do an interview on. And I've done several interviews on the Atonement, several of them with Josh Thurow, and one with Jonathan Rutledge. So Jonathan Rutledge published a recent book, and Josh Thurow's published a few articles on this. And he actually, I think his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article just came out on Atonement. But I've not done an interview specifically on a moral exemplar, at least some version of that theory. So I wanted to do that. And when I read your paper, it was really, really good. I'm not just saying that. I thought this was very illuminating. It was things that I'd not thought about before. And I'm really glad that you wrote it. So thank you both for writing it and doing this interview.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel like this paper, actually writing it for us was really like a profound experience. So it's nice to hear that other people get something out of it.
Yes. So let me just first ask, what got you interested in writing on the doctrine of the atonement? There's lots of things. You're both philosophers. You could be writing on lots of things. What was it about the doctrine of the atonement that got you interested in specifically a moral exemplar theory of it?
Yeah, so this paper, actually, the kind of like seed for this paper started when Allie and I were on vacation together. So we're not just co-authors, we're friends. And this was, like 4 years ago or something. It was 2019. I had just done research leave at Notre Dame, and I don't work on the Atonement. I'm actually a philosopher of science, and I do stuff with philosophy of religion as well, but like my primary stuff is in philosophy of science. But I had spent a year at Notre Dame listening to the conversations there about atonement. And then Allie and I had met up that summer. It was Allie and I, and my son came with us. And we were, just kind of hanging out, talking about philosophy like you do on vacation. And we were talking about atonement theories. And it's interesting because people tend to not like exemplar accounts or take them very seriously. And the explanation of why is because they don't explain the mechanism of atonement or something like this. And I, as a philosopher of science, found that language to be very strange, because I thought, well, one, if atonement is about reconciling a relationship, why would you expect it to be mechanical? I mean, the whole term mechanism or mechanistic explanation comes from the history of science in scenarios where you think that you can find mechanisms. But we don't think about forgiveness or reconciliation as being in a kind of mechanical framework. So that was just a strange way of thinking about it to me. And as we talked about it more, we were kind of like reverse engineering the conversation. Like, well, why do people think there should be a mechanism? Well, they think there's this problem of a debt. Well, why do they think that? And we were sort of like, I don't know, thinking through the problem. And we started getting really interested in what would it look like to try to come up with an atonement account, or what would it mean to think about atonement in a way that is more tied to human experience, or like our own experience of relational ruptures and stuff like that. So that was kind of, it just started out as a conversation. And the more that we talked about it and the further down the road we went, and obviously we're not the first people to try to think about atonement in the context of relationships, but we went on this journey, and that was kind of where we ended up.
That's really cool that you got to develop the ideas here on vacation. and that you're
Yeah.
friends in real life.
Yeah,
That's
actually,
awesome.
as we were preparing for this, we're trying to think what exactly was the thought process? And I was like, oh, I got it. I was like June 2019 on my phone because I have pictures of the like scrap paper that we were like trying to work it out on.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Okay, so in the paper, you say that many theories of the atonement have a standard assumption about the ordering of the problem that they're aiming to solve. So, what is that standard assumption, and how does the model that you develop differ from it?
So I think it's helpful to go into answering this question with a distinction between two different ways of understanding atonement. So, on the one hand, you can understand atonement in a really narrow sense, where it's about purging or cleansing of sins or something like that. But there's another sense of atonement too, which we call in the paper the broad sense of atonement, and this is the sense of atonement that has to do with reconciliation. So, when we talk about atonement in the broad sense, we talk about reconciliation. Okay, so keeping these two things in mind, these two senses of atonement in mind, the typical way of framing the problem is like what can we do to get atonement in the narrow sense so that we can get atonement in the broad sense. So atonement in the narrow sense has to come first. And theories of the atonement focus on, they're kind of like theories of narrow atonement. So they're trying to explain what does Christ's life, death, and resurrection do to achieve atonement in the narrow sense, because that is required for atonement in the broad sense. And when we say we flip the problem around, what we mean is that we understand atonement in the broad sense to actually be the first thing. That's the precondition for atonement in the narrow sense. So first, you need relationship with the divine, and from there, you get the cleansing or purging of sins.
And just piggybacking on that, I mean, we weren't the ones to make that distinction. Like William Lane Craig uses that distinction a lot in his work, but he's pushing the other kind of argument, right? That we can't sort of have this atonement in the broader sense unless we've been cleansed of our sin. Like that's a precondition. And so yeah, that's like what we're switching in the account.
Just for my own, I want to get clarification on this as I read it. One thought here is, before you can have relationship with God, you need to be cleansed of your sins. That's the standard assumption. In your model, relationship with God comes first, and it's in the context of that relationship with God that you can be forgiven of your sins and reconciled. Is that?
That's right.
Okay. You offer this intriguing interpretation of the fall. So what is your interpretation of it?
Okay, great. So before I talk about our account of the fall, I want to say something about what we take to be the received view, or sort of the view of the fall that's influencing other accounts of the atonement in this mechanism picture. So on those accounts, you have this sort of Augustinian story where, humans are created in perfection. We were perfect beings, but then Adam chooses to eat the apple, and with this comes sin. So we move from this kind of perfected state to a state of corruption, often called something like a stain on the soul. We get kind of moral dirt on us, and we're no longer clean. Because we're unclean, we can't be in relationship with God. And so this generates the problem that atonement's going to have to solve, right? It's going to have to clean that dirt or take away that stain so that we can be back in divine communion. On our picture, what we think happens in the fall, we focus a lot on what happens at the end of chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3, and kind of this transition that the human creatures seem to undergo. So before they eat the apple, it describes them as being naked and unashamed. And we attach that kind of nakedness to a type of immaturity, so they're like the first fall that I described attaches to like an Augustinian picture, but Irenaeus was another church father who had a very different picture of continual creation and what that looked like. And on this more continual creation picture, humans were created, so we were perfect, but our perfection didn't come from our moral state or our completed nature, but from our union with God. So we were created as these sort of immature beings, which God always intended to bring about to perfection. That was the plan for the human story, right? God was going to bring these human creatures into a state of moral perfection. But we don't start out that way. We're just sort of babies. And so on that picture, what happens, how we understand the fall, is that prior to eating the apple, so the apple is from the tree of judgment of good and evil, right? So it kind of gives the humans the capacity for moral judgment. And once they get this capacity, they pass judgment on themselves and feel really terrible. They judge themselves to be really terrible, both because they've just disobeyed God, but also in an even broader sense, they're able to see their kind of immaturity, their limitations, their weakness and vulnerability in comparison with like the almighty power of God. So you might think about, if you know anything about developmental psychology, this is very much like the story you get with actual human babies, right? When they're first born, they can't even distinguish themselves from their caregiver. There's this kind of perfect union and harmony. And it's only later as they develop that they start to be able to see their caregiver as separate from them. And that can sort of create some problems, which we'll talk about later. But it's kind of that same idea. So we think the fall is not falling from this morally perfected state and getting blemished. We think it's more being in perfect union with God and then falling out of that and sort of being unable to re-enter it because of our own shame. Our shame kind of disintegrating the relationship, our shame forcing us to self-isolate. But notice God hasn't stopped loving us or desiring relationship with us or given up on us because we made a bad choice, right? We are now hiding from God. We think that's what the story is saying.
Yes. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way before, but prior to their fall, they were naked and unashamed. But then, after their fall, they see their nakedness and hide. That seems to imply they're now in a state of shame. They're aware of their nakedness, their weakness, their frailty. I guess their moral failure as well. And so it's actually this state of shame that they're in. That's kind of I guess where you're placing the emphasis on. The fall was from a state of this perfect union with God to now being in a state of shame, feeling like we have to hide from God and separate ourselves from God.
Yeah. And actually what you're bringing up is something that I think is really interesting, that after they eat the apple, they're not like, oh no, we're bad. It's like they see that they're naked. And it's so interesting because they were always naked. Right? So it's not that they become naked. It's that they were always naked, but now they see their nakedness and they want to hide it. And I think that's very interesting in thinking about what has happened, what's caused this relational rupture. What you also don't see here is anything about a law or this kind of legal stuff that gets brought in later, that a lot of these other accounts are motivating to explain or solve. These kind of like mechanistic views. In the first story, when you go back to the original rupture, it looks very much like this kind of story of a relational break caused by shame.
And also, we didn't intend to deny that was a sin, that their disobedience was a sin. It's just not the reason, like directly, that we can't be in communion with God. It's the reason in the sense that it like causes them to do the thing that leads to their awareness, that leads to their shame. But it's not like the sin itself is like the reason that God cannot be in communion with us.
Yeah, that's helpful. Now, in the next section of your paper, you begin talking about the neurobiology and developmental psychology and what these disciplines tell us about how shame originates and how it can be overcome. So do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. So I think it can be helpful. I wanted to say a little bit about how we're thinking about shame in this paper and how it's different from some other ways of talking about shame. So we're thinking of it, we're approaching it as a neurobiological phenomenon instead of as something like a moral property or something about your standing in relationship to other people or boiling down to a certain thought. We're not thinking of it like that. We're thinking of it as like a bodily and specifically a neurobiological process. So shame is something that happens when when the activity of our sympathetic nervous systems, which is what is activated when we're pursuing something that we expect to end well, it drives arousal and movement. Shame happens when that activated sympathetic nervous system is abruptly shut down. So this could be triggered by a disapproving look from someone else or an unexpected response that communicates irritation or something like that. And that rapid shutdown of the sympathetic nervous system comes with all sorts of really uncomfortable physical and psychological effects. So we might blush, for example, so the blood rushes to our cheeks. We might actually run away from the situation. We might struggle to know what to say, have trouble finding the words. We could get really angry, break eye contact with other people. And in addition to like all of those physical responses, when you have this crash, you get what's called a disintegrating response, which is like the brain, the inner parallel to these more externalized responses that like drive you away from connecting with other people through like needing to leave or looking away or whatever. So disintegration is something that happens like within you. So what happens is that different parts of your brains, different functional parts of your brain turn away from each other. Your thinking self doesn't connect with your feeling self. And so the sympathetic crash disrupts not just your interpersonal relationships, but it impacts this intrapersonal side of you. It disrupts your mental function. So I was trying to think of an example for this. And just the other day, I was like checking my teaching evals, which is such a terrible experience. I mean, actually, it's not always terrible. I went to do it because I wanted something nice. And like, I often get nice comments in my evals. And I saw these like really negative evaluations. And I had this shame experience. And I wasn't even around anybody else. I was just like sitting there, working away in my office. And I started to have like an angry kind of response and then just like this kind of brain fog. And it took me a while to realize what was going on, to be able to name what was going on. But that's the kind of thing that was happening, like I wouldn't exactly call it, I wasn't driven to movement. I was just sitting at my desk. But, it was like a sympathetic kind of arousal met with this like abruptly shut down by this like disapproval. So that's like an example. But turning from that understanding of shame, that picture of shame, we think it can be illuminated, like where it comes from and how to resolve it by looking at the developmental case. So there's a lot of really interesting research in developmental neurobiology on how shame experiences originate and how the relationships of babies and their caregivers helps the baby process those shame experiences. So in the very early part of a baby's life, it experiences this really tight attunement with their caregiver. They're getting all of their needs met. When they express hunger, they're fed. When they express a need to be held, they're held, and so on. They have, when they smile up at their caregiver smiles back. So they have this really tight attunement. But as the baby gets older and they, like specifically it's around when they can start moving, like physically moving on their own away from their caregiver. So usually by 14 months, this is happening. They start to, experience this separation from their caregiver. So they're off doing something where their sympathetic nervous systems are highly aroused, like sticking something in an outlet or whatever. And then they turn around and look at their caregiver, and their caregiver doesn't match their affect. Their caregiver is not happy and excited about this. Their caregiver might say no, or have some sort of scolding look or look of disapproval or look of fear or something like that. And this mismatch causes the same kind of sympathetic crash for the baby that I described earlier. And it's an extremely negative experience for the baby, partly because they're used to the attunement, but also because they don't know how to regulate this crash themselves. Their brain just isn't developed enough to deal with it, and they can't get out of the negative state without help. So what happens in observations of good enough, that's not my term, but good enough caregiving relationships, is that the caregiver physically reaches out to the baby and reestablishes their bond. It's through this relationship that they can help the baby process the negative state that they are now in and can't get out of on their own. And so what the caregiver communicates by reaching out to the baby is a reassurance that they love the child, that the relationship is stable, whatever. And through that connection, the caregiver models the neuroregulation that is going to help the baby process the shame state. And this kind of cycle where the baby disrupts someone disrupts the attunement and then it gets repaired, that's called the disruption repair cycle. And it is through the repetition of that cycle that the baby learns how to process regulate their shame states. So the point is that the takeaway from the neurobiology, the developmental neurobiology, is that shame, the ability to regulate shame, is something that you achieve through a relationship.
Yes. You have to kind of meet the child in their state. So often, like, you have to get down on the floor, have eye contact, engage them, and sort of use, like, almost like you wire in your brain to carry them through it, because they haven't developed that part yet. So they can't modulate their emotions.
You talk about in the paper, there's 2 problems of sin that you describe that's in connection with shame. And can you just say what those 2 problems are?
Yes. So I think the first problem of sin is we have a tendency to resist God. And this is just hardwired into our neurobiology, right? We don't want to be vulnerable. And so we kind of have this, I think, like built-in now hardwired tendency to resist God. That's one problem of sin. And the second problem of sin is there's no, well, we call it like a blueprint. So in the ideal caregiver situation, so if I'm an ideal caregiver, which I'm not, but if I were, or just a good enough caregiver, I could maybe be that. Then, I've learned how to deal with shame when it comes. I know how to kind of regulate it and reintegrate my brain. And so I can do that for my child. But thinking about this in the broader theological analogy that we're trying to build, there's no sort of blueprint to come in to Adam and Eve and be like, okay, here's what you're feeling, and now I'm going to carry you through this, right? God is spirit. So like which it's really crying out for this kind of incarnation. Like you very much need a human that can come in and be that kind of embodied blueprint to transition the humans into a different state, to kind of like resolve the patterns in the brain, to show them a different way of thinking about it, or a different way to regulate their emotions, to help them re-regulate. That doesn't exist. And we see how that kind of spatters out right throughout the Old and the New Testament. And it's interesting because like right after the story of the fall, you get Cain and Abel, where like Cain murders Abel out of shame. He's so mad that Abel gets this sacrifice and gets approval and he doesn't. And he's so ashamed that he kills him. But so you see how shame is like now, processing out the big problem of sin. People are doing terrible things. They're cut off from God. They don't want to turn to God and do what God would ask them to do. And they can't resolve that kind of emotional dysregulation and physical sort of vector away from God, because we don't have this effective blueprint to help them resolve their shame state.
Can I add one thing about the Cain and Abel story? It's my now favorite part of the story since we started working on this, was the line that says that his countenance fell. So once his sacrifice was rejected, and once we had worked on the like biology of shame, so to speak, and then read that text, that really stood out to us as like an indication of the shame that he was feeling. Because that looking away is one of the physical hallmarks of shame.
Yeah, I'd never noticed that before. That's really interesting. Okay, so did you describe both problems there?
Yes. So we're predisposed to resist God. And this kind of is generative, right? You see how it plays out in all the like horrible acts that happen throughout the Old and then New Testament. And also, but like the other problem is there is no blueprint or way to resolve it.
Okay.
So And this again is contrasting with the kind of traditional problem of sin or the satisfaction view of the problem of sin, where it's like we have a debt that needs paid or we have a stain that needs removed. Here we're saying like, no, we have these bad inabilities to regulate, and we're trying to figure out how to, we need a blueprint to resolve them and we don't have one. That's the problem.
I see. Okay. Yes, that was helpful. Thank you. All right. So now we bring Christ back in. All that just kind of set up the problem. So how is it that Christ resolves these two problems of sin?
So I think picking up on what Megan was saying in answer to your last question, it can be helpful to think back to the parent-child case in developmental biology. So think about how the parent helps the baby process shame. First thing they do is they lower themselves to the child, they unite with the child, maybe physically, maybe through eye contact, and they meet with them in their shame state and thereby reassure the child that the relationship is secure. And Christ does something similar. He lowers himself, he humbles himself by taking on human form, by taking on the shame of the crucifixion. And then, just as the caregiver does with the child, he initiates this disruption repair cycle. So he actively models for us how to resolve shame so that our shame no longer makes this rupture between us and the divine. And so by doing this, he resolves that second problem of sin. He's passing on to us the blueprint for how to resolve shame. And so through enduring his humiliating death on the cross, and ultimately being resurrected into union with the divine, he shows us, he passes on the blueprint for us of how we can be vulnerable with God in our shame and brought back into communion with him. So that's how he resolves the second problem of sin. I started with the second one. But the first problem of sin is going to require a little something extra. The first problem was the biological tendency that we have to resist God, to resist the vulnerability, which we would have even if we are offered this effective blueprint. And so this problem, we think, to solve it, we need elevating grace. We need ongoing work of grace in our lives to make us better able to receive that blueprint.
Yeah, and I think here a lot of the language of like being born again, right? New life. And if you think very much like we need a new developmental story, we need new neurobiological structure, and like, but that has to come as a gift from God. But it's no accident that they come at the same time because they're, meant to work together.
You're not just talking about purely cognitive things, or are you? Like,
so I guess I'll say two things.
Are
One,
structures in the brain actually changing?
Yeah, so I didn't say new neurobiological life. I said the new life language. I don't.
Oh, okay.
There's definitely a part here that seems like mystery, or I'm not, you know what I mean? Like I have things that I speculative thoughts. One thing I will say is I think it's really interesting if you're thinking about the need of actual physical models. Like for us to change and learn to regulate, we really need a physical model. We don't need instructions. You need that human eye contact, physical contact. And it does tell a very physical story about the transmission of the gospel. And like that the crucifixion is public, it's witnessed by Jesus's disciples, and then that's transmitted by speech from people to people through discipleship. Like there is this ongoing kind of transmission happening through people. So I do think there's this kind of physical side. But I didn't say God gives us what is it to be born again? That's a mystery I have not solved. But I'm just saying that kind of language fits very nicely with this picture of thinking like, oh, what went wrong was like in our developmental story, we sort of got hardwired into these neurobiological patterns that like separate us from God and are resistant to God's will. And we need to kind of like start over again to have new development. We need new life, right? That kind of generative new life. What is it? And could you see it under a microscope?
Sure.
No idea. But I do think that just in keeping with the kind of theological analogy that we're drawing here, that kind of language is perfect, or it helps you think about it perfectly, that like God both becomes our new caregiver and we become the new baby. And now we're going to get this new story of attunement happening through Christ.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now at this point in the paper, you start considering objections to your view. And a common objection to moral exemplar theories of atonement is Pelagianism. So, what is Pelagianism, and is it a problem for your view?
Yes. So Pelagianism is the idea that we can achieve righteousness independently of God's grace. And so if you think back to like traditional frameworks of atonement, so you were sort of pointing this out, but what our paper does is we don't just give a new account of atonement. I think we're giving a whole different framework for thinking about atonement. And in the more traditional framework for thinking about atonement, exemplar views are often seen to like fall short because they seem Pelagian. And what that means is they suggest that we, by our own sort of capacities, are able to become good and righteous. And so like on those more traditional views, the idea is like we were perfect. Now have this stain on our soul. We can't be good. We need God to help make us good. Well, if the way that God makes us good is by setting an example, couldn't God have just written the example down? And aren't we really like, couldn't we have done it all along if we'd just been given better instructions, right? And that more traditional picture of an example. And I think it's hard to even motivate, I think, the Pelagian worry in the same way in our whole framework, but it seems worth addressing because this is so the traditional thing that people talk about with exemplar views. And I guess a few things. One, I think what's really critical here is the kind of model that Christ is, the kind of example, that physicality of the example, that enfleshedness of the example is very significant. Like, no, God couldn't have written it down, right? Like, and the fact that God couldn't do this without becoming embodied is very significant. And again, like in the baby case, it's not that the parent can just talk the child through it. They really have to, it's a kind of brain training that happens from these physical interactions. So there, I don't think you get this story of like, oh, we had the capacity on our own and we could just do it. It doesn't sound like that. In addition, we are very forthright. We think there's an additional gift of elevating grace, that God somehow gives us the ability to receive what Christ transmits to us, that just feels like that gift of new life. Again, how that all like fleshes out, I don't totally know, but so clearly God's at work there. And yeah, so, and again, it's interesting because here the kind of end of atonement for us isn't we're good and we became good on our own. The end of atonement for us is we're in right relationship with God. We're in relationship with God. We're in union with God. And so that doesn't even, I mean, what would it mean to achieve that on your own? Yeah, like that's not, so yes, I don't think that Pelagianism is a worry for us. And that's unique to exemplar accounts of atonement.
Now, we've used the term sin several times in the interview. We probably should have defined it earlier, but what exactly is sin in your view? And what's the relationship between sin and shame?
So I think we do want to be careful not to introduce the concept of shame as like a replacement for the concept of sin. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't deny that what happened in the garden was sin, that's what started this whole thing. So however you want to think about sin, we think it's a distinct concept from the concept of shame. But we think that these concepts are connected in really important ways, that sin and shame are connected in really important ways. So first, we think that shame is the result of sin. It's a really important result of sin. So Adam and Eve sinned, which resulted in a judgment of themselves as unworthy, and that judgment resulted in shame. And these effects got transmitted to the rest of humanity. And now we all begin our lives in a state of ruptured relationship with God. And so we think that sin is this, shame is the result of sin. And then the other important connection is that shame amplifies sin. So when we're cut off from God, our tendency to engage in sinful acts is intensified. And I think the Cain and Abel story here is another good example of that. So you feel you experience the shame, and it's from that state that we would commit, even worse sins. as we saw in the Cain and Abel story. So I think that that's how we want to think about sin in this paper, is not that, we're not saying, oh, shame. I mean, just because we locate the problem that the atonement must solve in this shame conversation, we don't mean that shame is therefore just like in and we can throw sin talk out the window. But we do think that they are connected concepts in important ways.
And sin seems like you're using that in a pretty traditional sense of maybe like a wrong committed against God. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, we still think about sin as disobedience to God. It's tricky because when I think about sin, like when I think about us, being sinful or something, I would think about our kind of dysregulated tendencies, like neurobiological tendencies, as part of sin construed in one way. But in this paper, we're really trying to be like, no, but we also still think people disobey God, right? We still think that people sin, but it's just more complex, and why that happens. And it's not, I don't think of sin as always just being this clear, intentional, willful choice. It's embedded in our embodied life. And so breaking that cycle, it takes much more than just like willing something different, I think. It really does take kind of like new capacities and like new generative life.
Okay. We're almost at the end here. Before we end, I want to ask you about this. So there's several places in the New Testament that connect Jesus' death to the law and Levitical sacrifice. So like I'm thinking of like John the Baptist says the Lamb of God. It's like he sees Jesus and he's like, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Something like that. So he's like connecting sin and this Lamb of God, a Passover lamb. I think John has him like crucified at the time of the Passover lambs. There's very much like connection between Jesus's death and Levitical sacrifice. So what role does the law and Levitical sacrifice play in your model of the atonement?
Yes, I'm going to answer this explicitly. I just want to piggyback. I think with the Passover lamb, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but I think, but that's part of what's interesting is it's like, yes, we have the lamb that takes away the sin of the world, but the Passover lamb isn't operating just to take away sin, right? Like it's marking out God's chosen people to give them new life. It's actually like giving the mark of the people God's going to lead through the wilderness into this new life, through this process of formation. And so just because I think sometimes, I don't think all of the connections to lamb is connection to like a sacrificial lamb, as in like the sacrifices in Leviticus. And a lot of the sacrifices in Leviticus aren't lambs. So that's a broader thing. And I say this because I think it's important. Like there's a lot of different imagery around the atonement in the New Testament. And also, even thinking about the Abraham and Isaac story, which is very much this type of how we get this story in the New Testament about like God giving up his son. But that's pushing back to the history of Abraham and Isaac and the idea of like, what would true love look like in a human to give up? Like, what could be more evident of love? And so what we really want to say is that Christ on the cross is an example of how much God loves us. And so God kind of resorts back to this story in the history of the Hebrew people about Abraham, who loved God so much that, would be willing. Well, there's lots of ways to read that story, but anyway, but I think that there's lots of imagery happening, and I don't think it's just this kind of legal imagery, even though people tend to emphasize that. And one other thing I want to say is earlier, you're starting at the same point as everyone else with this problem that needs to be solved. But if you look at a lot of the penal substitution and satisfaction accounts, they're not going back to Genesis. I mean, even we looked at all of these accounts, and even William Lane Craig in his new recent book on atonement that's supposed to be the real like exegetical view of the atonement, there's no mention of Genesis. It always starts in Leviticus. So I think that they're just privileging the role of the Levitical law in the story. So for us, we think, yes, God gives. well, God gives a couple laws, right? You get the law in Leviticus, but you also get a law in Deuteronomy. They're not exactly the same. But in the 10 Commandments and this kind of stuff. But like, so yes, God gives laws and I think we need to say a lot more about this, and we have not properly researched it. But our kind of thought about it is the law comes in as this like intermediate caregiver to take care of the human creatures until the arrival of Christ, knowing that just the law is never going to be able to transmit to us internally what we need to live a life that is in union with God, right? For all the reasons that we've said here. So the law comes to act, God cares about the human creatures. They aren't super interested in being in a close relationship with God. So God sets up this infrastructure to sort of try to govern them and help them have as happy a life as possible along their way. But you know what I mean? Like traveling and then in the promised land. But that law was never going to really be transformative in the way that what we see in the incarnation is supposed to be transformative kind of from the inside out. It's good, and keeping it is good. It was hard to keep, and that was a problem with it. But I don't think it's the reflection of like some independently existing law, which when violated,
makes it so that we can't be united with God.
Have to be resolved for us to be in a relationship. That seems to be like reifying it to me. I think it was, God working in context with his beloved children to care for them in the best way that a spirit could care for human creatures in their sort of dysregulated state.
Anything else to add on that point before we wrap up?
I think so. Allie, do you?
I was just going to say, I appreciated everything you said, Megan, but this is definitely a part of the paper where I would love if we had more time to do more work. I think this topic and the sin topic are both things that like we would have loved to write another a chapter's worth of stuff on. I think that they're really intriguing, objections, to the view that have invited us to like think more carefully about scripture and broader theological issues like sin. And so, we have our sort of starting point in reply and explanations of why we couldn't go into more detail than we did. But I think overall, we think both the sin question and the scripture about the law question are really like motivating and interesting questions for us.
Yeah, I definitely don't want it to be like, we don't think there's anything interesting to say here. I'm just trying to give a very broad picture of why we don't think it's like a, debilitating objection to our view.
Mm-hmm. Before we wrap up, this is related. In the paper, near the end, it's I could have been reading between the lines and you weren't intending to communicate this, but it seemed like you leaned toward thinking penal substitution, satisfaction theories, these face serious objections, and the atonements, it's best not to think of atonement in those ways. This is maybe your account is the best way, and those are not very helpful to think of the atonement in those ways. Did that come across? Is that what you intended?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think. It's tricky because I don't quite want to say like this is the view. I don't know that I really believe in something like that, or certainly that I would want to assert myself as having it. I think it's just complicated to understand this. And I think that part of what we do as Christians in different times is try to unpack them within our own cultural settings, in our own church settings, in our own kind of worlds that we're living in, and like try to understand how they can impact our lives. I can say that for me personally, growing up in the Christian church and having various relationships to it throughout my life, like atonement never made sense to me before I wrote this paper. And it makes a lot of sense to me now. And it like in this deep way, I mean, both in a way that has really changed the way I interact with my children, the way I interact with other people, but how I understand like God's love for me, and what the cross means. Like it just, the other, just growing up, and this isn't even theological, it just didn't make sense to me, because it's like, okay, Christ had to pay your debt. And I'm like, well, but my debt, like, the wages of sin are death. Okay, well, who made that up? God, right? Like, couldn't God have said the wages of sin are a bad shipment of produce? Or so, like, it didn't seem like enough to me to, like, I just couldn't quite. Obviously, I was a kid. And then as an adult, you have a more complex understanding of the world, and like why sin is such a problem, and how it infects our communities, and how like we couldn't have heaven, because heaven for some people is always going to be hell for other people when we have the kind of hearts that we do, right? And so it's like, I get why we need transformation, but I think for me, being able to own the story in this way, to think about it in this way, and also just for me maps so much more to my own experience of like God loving me as I am, of Jesus loving me as I am, and working with me to sort of come into a new kind of life, versus, I don't know, like that God was so upset with me and then forgave me or something like that. I don't know. It just, so yeah. So for me, this is super helpful and has changed the way I think about things, and kind of demystified, although there's still a lot of mystery in this account, but it's demystified certain things for me. But different people are coming from different spaces, and yeah.
Did you want to add anything there?
Oh, I have nothing like as rich to say as that, but I will say a frequent comment we get actually is like, okay, people are interested in it and they just want to combine it with like their otherwise favorite like transactional view of the atonement, and they're like, why couldn't we do that? And I mean, I kind of think, I guess you could. It seems a little redundant to me. I don't really think those other accounts do something that this doesn't, like solve a real problem that this doesn't. What else was I going to say about that? Oh, and then of course there are like all these other kind of independent concerns about those other views, which we just completely neglected. I think we had like a parenthetical remark about those.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's like this whole, broader conversation about options and, some of the challenges to the alternatives to this view as well. So I always appreciate it when people want to like take a little of what we had to say in this paper and add it to something that they already independently take to be true. But I think for me, I didn't find the other views very compelling, kind of echoing what Meghan was saying. And so, I mean, and we just left it in the paper, like, here are some concerns with those views.
Sure. I see.
Sorry, one other thing that I want to say on a more intellectual note about this is I actually think it's very tricky. And this is part of why we leave it more open, is like drawing the line about what has to be explained by atonement versus like the broader story of salvation and reconciliation. And, it's hard because like we're kind of, and this is why it's like we're speaking in human terms, and we have these arbitrary distinctions about like what you're going to give an account of and what things you should explain with that account. Because there's lots of questions too about like why Christ is suffering. But I think, full answers to that aren't just about like, I don't think it's because like that's how much blood God needed to forgive people or something, like I think the story of like that, when God comes to earth as a human, God dies an unjust death on the cross publicly, like shamefully, says a lot about what God has chosen, how God has chosen to act in this world, to interact with us, the kind of life that God calls us to. I don't think that it's just something that you're going to be able to answer by this very narrow mechanistic account of the atonement. So that's why I'm a little, I mean, yes, I don't hold something like a satisfaction or substitution view in addition to this. Maybe at some point someone would convince me I should. But I also just think that the story is so big, and I'm hesitant to like rigidly defend any of these artificial lines about different, like this doctrine and that doctrine, and it's connected to this. I think it's more permeable.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, how would you both like to summarize this discussion, or just give concluding thoughts? It doesn't have to be, let me sum up everything, but just your concluding thoughts.
Oh, I feel like I already gave them.
I was gonna say, Megan, I think that you summarized a lot of the personal, I don't know, side of like the process of writing this paper. And I wouldn't call it a settled view, but it doesn't like preoccupy us constantly in the way that it did when we were writing it. So I guess like post-publication or whatever. And for me, like I didn't have a child when we started this paper, and now I have a baby who's just entering into this part of his development. And I think about this paper every single day, and it informs how I relate to him and how guilty I feel about how I relate to him and all this stuff. But it really has had such a significant personal impact for me in how I think about supporting my son, and how I think about making space for my relationship with God to develop, and what that has looked like in the faith that I grew up in and that I worship in. And anyway, I echo a lot of your sentiments, Megan, about how impactful it was for us to work through this paper and read the other authors that we read to work through these ideas.
Well, I really enjoyed the paper, and I personally benefited from it. I enjoyed it so much, I should say, that I told my wife she needed to read it. So she read it and really enjoyed it. She actually read this stuff about shame and like trauma-informed theology and this sort of thing. That's what she's interested in. So she loved the paper. She read that book. You quoted it, or you cited it several times, The Soul of Shame.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. She read that book previously and was like, oh, they're citing this book several times. And I was like, oh yeah, I remember you reading that. So anyway, I just wanted you to know it made an impact on me, and so much so that I had my wife read it. And trust me, I don't tell my wife to read many of the papers that I bring on to discuss. So she really enjoyed it.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining me, and for the viewers, thank you for watching. Please check out my playlist on the Atonement. Like I mentioned, I've got interviews with Swinburne, Josh Thorough, Jonathan Rutledge, and now, Dr. Allison Krile Thornton and Dr. Meghan Page. So thank you for watching, and again, thank you too for joining me.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
All right, keep exploring Christianity.